In the policy forum, I'm asking them to distill at least a few, maybe 2 or 3 new ideas, broad, general ideas that relate to policy, commons, and climate change. Share these with all of us. And after the panelists have made their opening statements, I would open the floor for a round of questions or comments. Again, this being a policy forum, I would urge questions or comments to be as broad in scope as the scope of the policy forum itself, as well as the opening statements and presentations from the panelists. We will take a round of questions. We will hand it back to the panelists, ask them to respond either individually or collectively to the comments that we have received. And also please feel free to make comments and not just ask questions, directed questions, to contribute to that conversation. And then the panelists will respond individually or collectively to the comments that have come from the audience. And we will hopefully have a back and forth in terms of conversation and the issues that come up. What I'm hoping is that by 6 p.m. we will be able to have at least 2 of these rounds. So opening statements, a round of questions, responses, another round of questions and responses. My sincere hope is that the conversations will not end at 6 p.m., but I will have to put an end because it has been a long day and some of us perhaps did not even get tea. In the light of time running away, I will stop here and I will ask the panelists to begin making opening statements. We have decided on a sequence that is largely random, starting with Gopal Kadekori, followed by William Sunderland, Veena Agarwal, A. Damodaran, and Jesse Ribot. And what I would also request the panelists when they come up and when they make their opening statements is spend a few seconds, if not up to a minute, to introduce themselves. Thank you very much.
My name is Gopal Kadekori. I come from India. I live in a state called Karnataka. I was formerly director of an institution called Institute for Social and Economic Change. I discovered from Ashwini's communication that there are only 7 or 8 sentences that you can speak clearly because of my Indian accent to a large number of international audience. And I think that's the time I have. In his opening remarks, introduction, he said this panel is going to think differently or present something which they have been thinking differently. So that itself is a challenge. So I am just thinking now what is it we should be talking differently. Anyway, I think I must make the first statement that much of the commons that we are referring, whether it's a tank or village pond or small water bodies, flowing water bodies, or common lands, as our Indian word is called panchayat land, or forest compartments closer to the village, on which the village has some access, villagers have some access. All these are to be called only local commons. I'm sure this debate is not going to be on any other commons, climate for example. That brings, or rather that shocks me in a way to think differently, because we all think globally on these matters. The global community around this table and in this conference, but we must and we have to act only at the local level. So it's a local action, but global thinking. My second statement, if I may be permitted to say, is the ecosystem services provided by the local commons are not at all being compensated. At best, in some situations, people with political power or other extra monetary powers, they will be able to grab the benefits or the gains of the local commons, be it water, be it access to the forest resources. But I think ecosystem services for the society, for the people, for the locals are not really being fully compensated for which they have been protecting them. However, referring to developing countries particularly, there has been enormous thinking on developing local level developmental institutions, not ecosystem institutions or institutions to manage the ecosystems, but developmental institutions. Because the process of development was, or rather is, focused on bringing livelihood, or rather, as our Honorable Indian Minister mentioned, growth. 9% growth is required for people to rise above. So this developmental focus has taken many countries to decentralized local level governance, local level institutions to deliver developmental objectives, be that the electricity supply, be that the water, drinking water, be it road, or some minimum social services like health care, educational facilities, or nutritional care, or care for women and so on. But the role of this is my fourth statement, but the role of these development institutions have never taken any interest or they have least idea of dealing with local commons. I am referring to in Indian language an institution called panchayats. Under the Indian Constitution, we have an act under which local institutions do exist, and they do operate, they do function. There is a devolution of power, there is a devolution of financial resources, down all the way to the village. But these development institutions, under the Constitution of India, even though they have 29 functions or activities to be performed, of which some of them have got to do with land, forest land, water, things like that, but they do not do. So the developmental institutions created at the grassroots level or the local level are not ecologically sound. In other words, similarly I can give examples of water user association, created only for those who have access to water or who need water. But this is not an institution meant for the community as a whole. Another example I can give you is access to forest through a system called Joint Forest Management, or an institution called Village Protection Committee, or the institution, which is not very legal but structured. But they also have behind them the political or some kind of social powers, because of which these are not really functioning as local institutions of governance. We need, therefore, very specialized system. This is my main statement, to deal with local commons, not in parallel with development institutions, but make the development institutions take a real through the constitutional forces, through thinking, social and political thinking differently, to involve, to internalize the pressures coming from common on account of lack of common property, ecosystem services. So local institutions have to be strengthened differently. Unfortunately, we have economic instruments. CDM is a classic example of economic global instrument, which is available. It's not accessible to local institutions. If you have studied the functioning of the CDM system globally as well as in the Indian situation, not even 1% of the CDM CRs are allocated to anything to do with the local commons. They have to do with the fuel switching, they have to do with green technologies, they have to do with wind energy, alternative energies. Yes, they are all very interesting opportunities, but they are not functioning. So, how to make CDM kind of institution available to the local governance institutions like the development institutions, for which you need a policy, legal policy, constitutional policy, to create a federation of local institutions. They will have to have power. So when they federate among themselves, they will have put, as you say, every drop and drop and drop added becomes a river. It becomes a powerful institution, and they will have enough to say in terms of stadium how much of CR they will have contributed. Whether it is water body improvement of water body, regenerating tanks, or the forest compartment reforestation, what is carbon sequestration, they can add, but at village level they will add up to a few tons. No CDM institution, no CDM writer is willing to take up that kind of challenge work. It is impossible because it's too small a unit of functioning. So we need a federation. Now, what kind of federations? I can think to begin with the Ministry of Rural Development as an institution. Add up all the CERs coming out of Gram Panchayats or the self-help groups contributions and make a joint claim against CDM, or create additional institutions or federations so that the local level institutions have enough financial resources, legal support to take up climate change issues. These are my statements. Thank you, sir.
My name is William Sunderland. I work at the Center for International Forestry Research. I was asked to speak for no more than 5 minutes. I will strive to meet that challenge, but forgive me in advance, I'm going to be rather telegraphic and take for granted a certain amount of knowledge about climate change and REDD. My comments are going to focus on climate change and REDD, as I am working in a global comparative study on REDD. The project as a whole works in 9 countries. The part I'm working on is working in 5 countries. I want to take as my point of departure the comments that were made by Eleanor Ostrom yesterday, where she pointed to the central fact of how getting out of problems of the commons, having a collective action solution, has required talking, very simply that. And this has enabled escape from the tragedy of the commons in ways that were unanticipated. But more than talk, we also need to know there is a problem. And without being mysterious, I will set that statement aside right now and come back to it in just a couple minutes. REDD has a tremendous amount of potential for doing good and for doing damage. We know that in principle. It's just getting off the ground. We have a little bit of evidence in practice for both of those. In terms of the interests of local people, there are 2 main structural streams through which effects will happen to people. One is that policies and practices are being put into place, will be put into place, that have tremendous consequences for existing uses of forests by local people. Yet another structural stream of potential change is that forest carbon turned into a commodity, and especially that turns into one that is traded on the levels that people are imagining, will affect people's lives by perhaps creating livelihood opportunities or alternatives that currently do not exist. In this context, tenure is tremendously important for local people. Why? Well, we can say that in principle, simply looking back in history, that forest peoples tend to be dispossessed from the national polity. They tend to be marginal. They tend to have voices that are not heard. And when resources are developed in their midst, they rarely get an equitable share of what is being taken out, and frequently are become victims of a process, especially in cases where there are large economic rents being taken out of their midst. So from that point of view alone, we know that rights are important. We know that the pre-existing tenure conditions in RED are going to affect how RED unfolds, for better or worse. And bringing us full circle, we know that RED will have effects on tenure. Rights at the local level, in principle, provide the opportunity for people to say yes or no to RED coming into their midst, and if they say yes, to shape how it will unfold. In principle, rights that govern existing livelihoods will be affected, as well as the access to the benefit stream. I don't want to paint an entirely negative picture because in one way it's amazing how much policy attention there has been to rights in the RED context, given that it is going to be, or possibly maybe, one of the biggest rural development projects in history. It's perhaps no surprise that rights has gotten so much attention, but I think it is a credit to some people and some institutions that most governments are giving public consultations that include attention to rights. It may not be all we want, but at least this is often happening. The negotiating text in the RED deal that just emerged does give attention to rights. The RED RPIN plans give attention to rights, perhaps inadequately, but it does. And perhaps most importantly, many RED project proponents in seeking third-party certification through the CCP standards will be required to resolve pre-existing tenure issues. In spite of this good news, I have to be frank that at this moment, I have a great deal of cause for worry. In most cases, even if there is a request for permission at the local level through free, prior, and informed consent, it's often inadequate. The issues of tenure ambiguity and contestation are in almost no case resolved at the early stages of RED. And we know from the formal rights that are allocated to people in forests that even if they are awarded, there are often problems with enforcement of those rights. But I will bring us now to the central problem that I wanted to point us to, which is a circular problem, a quandary, a problem of inertia. At many RED project sites, the proponents are not systematically educating people about climate change or about the details of the project that will unfold. Partly this is because of the slow development of RED after the policy paralysis that happened coming out of Copenhagen last year. But I think in most cases it's because they are afraid, for partly good reasons, of raising expectations. Or at least this is mostly what we hear. And yet, if people living in forested areas are going to negotiate how their participation in RED, defend their rights, get an equitable share, make sure that it doesn't turn into a disaster, that it affects them, they need to know. They need to know what is being done. And yet now my sense is that most people have very little knowledge. And the way in which this problem is circular is that I think we're at a historical moment where many people are imagining that tenure may have been overblown as an issue, because right now tenure arrangements are not being addressed on a massive scale. There are voices of protest against RED, of course, and outcries about tenure issues, but at many sites there is not, and I believe it's because they don't know what's going on. And yet the quandary that we are in is that when the restrictions begin to be imposed, when the rules of the game are put in place, when the money begins to flow, this is when people will say, wait a minute, there's a big problem here. But when that happens, the rights issues will not have been addressed in a prior way, in the ways that the policies have intended in their statements. With that, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you. I got inducted into this at lunchtime on the condition that I be allowed to be different. So here goes. What I'm going to argue is, I'm Beena Agarwal. I'm a professor of economics and the director of the Institute of Economic Growth. I did not name it and claim no responsibility for the title of the institution. What I'm going to argue is really is for the recreation of commons in unusual contexts. Now we know that one of the most important problems of climate change is food security, and 80% of farmers in South Asia, very large numbers of farmers across the developing world, are small farmers cultivating less than 2 hectares. The shortage of land, labor, skills, inputs, bargaining power, and peasant farming is par excellence individual privatized farming as it is conceptualized. The one time when it was conceptualized differently, which was under socialist collectivization, it was seen as disastrous, and since then there's been massive decollectivization. I'm going to argue, however, that we need to recreate or think of recreating commons even in farming communities. And I feel this is very important because without some sort of collectivities, I call it collectivities to separate them from cooperatives, collectivization, collectives, the whole historic baggage. And what I have in mind is farmers, small farmers coming together, bottom up, voluntarily, relatively homogeneous, participative in decision making, egalitarian in distribution, and with mechanisms, local mechanisms for stemming free riding. So in a form, you have a set of principles which we know do work for other kinds of commons. This is very different from, by the way, socialist collectivization, which was top-down, very large-scale, coercive, non-participative, and so on. And I feel this is important because a lot of things in climate change, whether we're talking about adaptation or mitigation, require a number of various sorts of measures. Some of those measures that we're familiar with, for instance, soil conservation measures. We can talk about rainwater harvesting systems. We can talk about smaller systems for dealing with water shortages, etc. What we also know is that apart from the fact that farmers are small and increasingly becoming smaller, is that we have a demographic shift and you have a feminization of agriculture taking place. So in fact, added on to existing vulnerabilities, you have increasing vulnerabilities. And the difficulty to absorb at an individual farming level, if you're half an acre, 1 hectare farmer, any kinds of inputs which governments might provide. In terms of infrastructure. So what am I arguing? I'm arguing two things. At a minimum, I'm suggesting that we have collective approaches, and much more collective approaches for farmers to invest. And this could be investment in water, there could be investment in a variety of other measures. This is not esoteric. In fact, historically, if you go back, you'll find examples. I found examples going back a couple of 100 years, where farmers in Indian Punjab, jointly 3 or 4 farmers got together to invest in groundwater. And today also, 10 years ago when I was doing a field work in Rajasthan, which is semi-arid, I found very interesting. I think I have time. It's very interesting. I asked this group of farmers, well, you know, how much land do you cultivate? And somebody said half an acre, 1 hectare. I said, how much is irrigated? They said 100%. I said, how is it possible? So one of them said, for instance, I have 3 fragments in 3 parts of this village. I've invested with 8 farmers each in 3 parts of the village, so I own 3/8 of a tube well. And so that's a form of a collective. However, since we're running out of time, what I want to suggest, however, that we need to move further and take a leap and talk about pooling land in bottom up. Encourage in some ways forming of commons, pooling land for joint cultivation. Now there are many examples, and I'll give you 3 where this is being done successfully. One is in the transition economies. There are increasing evidence to show that after the 1980s decollectivization, when farm families had options of going individual, many of them chose not to. They actually came together with other families, 3 or 4 families, up to 15 families, to jointly pool their land and cultivate. You can find these examples in Nicaragua, in East Germany, in Kyrgyzstan, in Romania. I'm sure in other places, but those are the case studies that I know of. And recent research shows in a fairly robust way that the productivity, the profitability, the sustainability of these farming enterprises is better than on individual family farms of equivalent size. The second example is actually in Andhra Pradesh. Maybe some of you will be visiting the Tech and Development Society. I've been writing about that for many years. There's a women's farming groups who either purchase land jointly or lease in land jointly, and have been farming since 1989. And if you talk to the farmer, the women, they're doing organic farming, and they're much more sustainable than other examples that you would find. There are other examples I can get to in question. And the third, and I'll finish with that, is an example I came across recently, where in the Indian Punjab, which is the richest part of the country in terms of farming, you have male farmers coming together because they want to take, pooling their land to take advantage of facilities for cold storage, which it is much more economical to do. So basically you have examples from extreme subsistence, rain-fed, to the other. And I feel all these examples are important, and any measures, what they actually tell us, and what also drawing on the literature on the commons and cooperation that Ellen Ostrom and others, and all of you have put together, is that people can cooperate. That we know, and trust and reciprocity we can build on. Why don't we take a leap and create commons in spaces where we haven't done so far? Thanks.
I work as a professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. I flag a few points which partly come out of my research, partly inspired by criticisms. The first point is the issue of climate change and the commons is very commonly linked, as Mr. Sunderland mentioned, to REDD, red. And one gets to see red in red for the only reason that red is something which is project driven and is supposed to be top-down approaches. Red will be soon based on monitoring and verification by a centralized agency. So red stands for everything that Professor Bina Agarwal said we should not be standing for. Collectivist initiative to drive the commons, spontaneous collectivization, not the forced collectivization drive of Stalin. So red can be Stalinistic without sounding so. Now let me take a look at where red is failing to mention, the discourse on red is failing to mention, what are the points that the discourse on red is failing to mention. Sustainable livelihoods, absolutely nothing is discussed in the red text. Sustainable risk management, nothing is discussed in the red. And when I am talking of these two terms, I am talking of small and marginal and landless labor. I am not talking of the well-to-do farmers. Now, in my view, these are two fatal omissions in the red debate. And this is not likely to be accepted by countries like India and China. I was unfortunately not here yesterday when the minister gave a statement of the pressures that we are under. I saw the report in Hindu today. But what I am very clear is there is very little in the climate change debate that is linked to the common property resources in terms of sustainable livelihood and sustainable risk management. Now, here I should flag a couple of points which Dr. Kadekudi mentioned about the futility of the CDM CERs. They don't get a good price in the markets. They are not meant to get a good price in the markets. Nor are they helping the farmers, nor are they helping anyone. So the CDM, now the stage has come in 2012 when a new agreement comes. The European Commission doesn't want, European Union countries do not want CDM to exist at all. And we are still asking for it, thinking that we will be getting some money out of the whole exit. I think that's a very valid point. RED is also being situated or being talked about as getting situated within CDM. This is not a very great idea. Now, India has been saying that we need a premium on the conservation efforts that we have done, which is true. We have been basically a conservation-driven forestry system that we had, Forest Conservation Act. It has a lot of problems. But in spite of that, India is one of the few countries which has halted deforestation. According to RED, if you halt deforestation, we will give an incentive. If your past has not been good, we will give an incentive to correct. Those whose past has been good, this is goes against the canons of equity or burden sharing, which is discussed in climate change before. Now, I will only take off from a small point which Professor Adhanom mentioned. And I thought this was an interesting ticket that I saw. My studies have been of three ecosystems. One is the coastal ecosystem. I looked at the shorelines. I did not look at the fishing issues. People like John Gray have looked at it at far greater detail. I don't know what it is there. I use it. And I looked at the coffee plantation ecosystem, the rich man's domain, with poor landless laborers employed, and I have looked at the semi-arid environments in Karnataka. I have found that the critical policy failure of any government, including the government of India, that we thought price stability will give livelihoods to people, sustainable livelihoods to people. Therefore, we had procurement policies, we had procurement footprints, we had all kinds of procurement policies, which were fiscally unsustainable and did not benefit the poor person, poor farmer. It benefited the trader. The farmer does not want price stability, he wants income stability. And I thought that was a Bina Agarwal's point that the collective approach, what percentage, what will be the impact of collective approach on income stability is a matter that needs to be debated. That's a point that creates public goods. No, RED is not about public goods. If you see the Australian proposal, I don't know who is from Australia, I will just run away if somebody is from Australia. Australian proposal says, please link it to carbon markets. I am not against carbon markets, I am for carbon markets. But I am afraid that there will be nothing for the landless labourer and the small farmer and the marginal farmer from a carbon market. And therefore, I would say, let us, I think it's a kind of forum, I am not trying to foreclose the option, I have just half a minute. Let us think of collective approaches and to creating income stability for the people through a very imaginatively designed RED program. And then we will see that it is something which can become some property management with climate change. So on this note,
Hi, I am Jesse Ribot, and I am now at the University of Illinois in the Department of Geography, and I run something called the Social Dimensions of Environmental Policy Initiative at the University of Illinois, where we try and essentially bring the social sciences to bear in multiple ways on issues of environment, environmental change, but environmental policy as well, and how that ends up affecting people. Right now I have 2 climate-related projects that I think are relevant to this discussion. One is called the Responsive Forest Governance Initiative. It's a 10-country comparative study ostensibly on the effects of REDD on local democracy. Now, of course, REDD hasn't happened, so you can't study it. So really looking at the past, looking at forestry policy and projects separately, but both explicitly, and how they have affected representation, belonging, and the production of a public domain in forestry is what we're trying to look at as a way of developing guidelines in the future for REDD implementation, so it doesn't, as most forestry policies have, destroy local democracy. The second project, as introductory, is on the causal structures of vulnerability, doing comparative work across multiple case studies so that we don't just look proximately. And I'm trying to sort of put to last the things that other people have addressed that I have wanted to address, but I want to bring up adaptation, because adaptation has not been mentioned yet. Almost every project in the world is now adaptation, whether it's opening a can of tuna fish or planting a tree. All of that is adaptation. This is partly chasing the funds. I find it a very disturbing and dangerous word. We're stuck with it. We have to adapt to adaptation, because adaptation, being a biological metaphor, I don't think applies so much to society. I don't like the implications of social Darwinism. I don't like the implications that the individual unit has to adapt, and all that society can do is help them to adapt. I think we need to ask, why was this term chosen? To avoid thinking about causality? When you think of adaptation, you don't think, why do people have to adapt, or what in the first place? You think, oh, how do they adapt? How to help them get over that threshold? But the question of how they got there, to that threshold of vulnerability, is avoided. The term vulnerability and coping has been pushed to the side. I think we need to get back into those questions of not just the proximate, but the social, political, economic infrastructures and processes in which marginality is produced and that makes vulnerability in the face of climate change. Vulnerability does not fall from the sky. It is on the ground. It's an underlying set of conditions, and in commons we need to be attending to that. So what I just, very quickly, I want to say is a little bit about REDD. REDD, I think, is a great threat. It's a threat to forest peoples. It may be a great benefit to carbon, but I think it's a threat to forest people, and that's my concern. And I think by having people with that concern, it will be less of a threat, and we can do better. And I think this is what William is working on, those sorts of issues. I think also we need to really pay a lot of attention to one of the biggest enclosure movements, commodifications we've ever seen. In a time of market fetishism, we really need to ask ourselves, what is this privatization of forests and common properties doing? And that brings me to a few issues that I think are very interestingly related to what Bina had to say. And that is, in the sense that, for me, there is obviously vulnerability is not equal to poverty, but in fact there's a great overlap. People in forests are poor. They're poor often because they're not allowed to gain any of the wealth of the very lucrative resources around them. They're kept out of it systematically. And I think we need to look at the question of collective holding of forests, commons at a larger scale, but look at it under representative authority, bringing together the question of democracy and commons, and bringing it together with dirty words like tax. Okay? I think, I'll give you an example. The producer price of charcoal in Senegal is $2 a sack. It sells in the city for $12 to $30 a sack, and the cost of transport is $3 a sack. The producer, basically $200 a year. The merchants up to $500,000 a year. So that kind of extraordinary wealth is unexcusable to keep out of the forest villages, to take from the forest villages, or who are poor, can't even send their kids to school. We need a tax, not a tax of 15 or 30%, because they would put it on the producer price, those $2. We need a tax of 800, 1,000%, so that there's a tax equal to the merchant's profit that goes to the villages, that's set nationally so that local jurisdictions don't have to compete themselves down on prices. Then there would be something to invest, but it's only to be invested publicly if there is a public domain under a public authority of some sort that in some way is accountable to and represents that local population. I think those are issues we need to be churning up in our discussion of climate and commons, because if we don't reduce vulnerability by giving people the income they need and the income security, then I think they're going to remain vulnerable, and especially in the face of things like red, become more vulnerable. Thank you.
After a series of excellent presentations, what I would like to do is take a set of questions. I'm sure there will be many. If you raise your hand and I catch your eye, I will try to distribute questions as much as I can. And after I have had a few, I will stop and hand it over back to the panelists. While you ask your question or make your comment, it doesn't have to be a question at all. Please feel free to share any comments that you may have. Please remember that the panelists themselves had only 5 minutes, so the shorter you keep it, the more comments that we will be able to get in. Okay. Shoot.
I think how to link climate change with comments. I think we discussed a lot about red, about carbon. The big issue in the region is about water. I think and I didn't hear anything about transboundary water management issues in the region. And for instance, the river links all nations and downstream and upstream. And also look at this year in Pakistan, the big floods, and also last year, and also the big drought in the Mekong and the low Mekong. I think the climate change really impact on the. We have two sides of a constructed risk, we already mentioned also by GC and by our India colleague. One is climate change constructed risk, like you get too much, too little water. But another is socially constructed risk, and for instance, institution. And I think so. That's it's a good thing. China, India, big the BRIC countries working together on carbon issues, but also unfortunately also transboundary in the local base, water management is totally lacking. I'd like to ask the panel to address those is more complete policy issues.
Thank you. Craig?
Hi, Craig Glover from Unmanaged University. To Bina, it's not working. It's not working. A question to Bina. First, I just want to say I was absolutely seduced by your presentation. I'll sign your petition. This is a policy forum, and I have to confess that I find policy absolutely mysterious. I don't understand the calculus of how policy comes into being, nor do I understand how policy actually translates into action on the ground or change on the ground. I find this absolutely mysterious. But I would like to question you about if we want to enable and encourage the kind of collectivities that you were talking about, what would a government policy at various levels, at a local, a state, and a national level, what would you imagine that would look like? And then while I got the microphone, I want to tip my hat to Jesse. Thank you for mentioning tax. I'm surprised that we've gotten to the end of the second day of the conference before somebody finally mentioned that dirty word. But thank you for bringing that in.
Any others? Figure?
Yes. I thank the panelists for interesting comments. One area I haven't heard any comments on is appropriate institutions or the lack of them. And so perhaps I'll make a comment on that and then invite panelists to address that. Much of climate change research has been done at the international level through GECs, these big models that basically produce generalized, averaged out climate projections. But in fact, the effects of climate change are felt at the local level. And they're not based on averages, they're based on extreme events, increased variabilities, impacts on livelihoods, impacts on life. And to me, there seems to be a gap between where the impacts are felt at the local and regional level and where the decisions are taken at the national and international levels. In fact, there's some gaps. A bunch of my resilience colleagues did a study on international institutions that look at environmental change. And what they found was basically an institutional gap. There is a serious shortage of capability at the international level to address and engage in environmental change, and not just climate change. Remember, Jesse, there's more than climate change going on when we say environmental change. And yes, the vulnerability adaptation questions are there. Whichever way you put the question, seems there's a institutional gap, or perhaps the may agree or may not agree.
Couple more. Jeff?
I'm used to talking to trees, so normally I can be heard. I just wonder whether the panelists have thought about a bigger systemic change that's needed. I mean, we talk about growth and we throw these things out, but if we look at the kind of deep-rooted cause behind these issues, it's the entire kind of the unassailable construct of the global economic system that we have right now. And then what happens is we see that as maybe too overpowering, and we come right down back to our local commons issues. I think we have to be able to present a vision for an integrated alternative economic system that builds up from the commons, but that thinks carefully through what would be those institutions at the local level, collective, farmer collectives, associations, what would be the regional level of markets and reciprocity, and how will that move then up to a higher level. But we need to build up the complete system, otherwise we'll continue tinkering, and the primary cause of both the climate issues and the massive inequity issues will simply continue to get replicated.
Walter? Gopal said that CDMs, and also Damodaran, the CDMs have been given up by the European Commission. However, what I see is that one side they have given up the idea of CDM, CER, and on the other, they are going towards turning the northeast of India into a carbon sink for Europe. So building carbon sinks seems to have taken the place of CDMs, and I find that very dangerous because a mega biodiversity zone is being turned into a carbon sink, which will be mainly by planting commercial forests. Now, how do you suggest that? I come from the Northeast. How do you suggest that you deal with it? Is there a possibility of accepting it and seeing how Bina's suggestion of voluntary cooperation through self-help groups and others can turn that into community forestry, and what policy changes are required for that? Otherwise, just a carbon sink with the commercial forest is going to be disastrous for our region.
question?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you to the panel. I also want to say something about Ben's proposal, and I think one of the weaknesses of some of the things we've been hearing at the conference has been a focus on protecting the commons. It's almost like there's a defensive action. It's almost like the hordes are at the gate and we're just going, oh, we've got to protect this little space, and we've got this little space here, and look, this little river here is beautiful, we need to protect it. But I think one of the things we need to recognise is that new commons are being created all the time. New ways of dealing with the commons are being created all the time, and I think what we need to do is encourage that creation. And I think from that process, then maybe that's where we get this economic system. And you know, I mean, most of my work has been around the issue of the urban commons and watching people create urban spaces which are increasingly shared. And I think one of the things that we need to consider is how do we make those links between the urban and the rural commons, which are often lacking. And one final point is, as an Australian, I apologise on behalf of my government, everything it's done in the last 14 years. I'm really sorry. I personally wasn't responsible, but I know they do suck. Thank you.
We will see if we can come back for another round, but I do also want to give the panelists a chance to respond, as well as all of us the chance to listen to their responses. One of the overarching theme from the responses is something that just resonates with me, especially over the last 1 year. The more I learn, the more I read, the more I talk to people about climate change and its responses in terms of policies that are on the table, is that the human response to climate change in terms of mitigation or adaptation is going to be worse for the poor people than climate change itself. And that is tragic. And it's about the policies that are on the table. And the more we can do to either eliminate bad policies or make them into good policies, the better it will be. And this conversation is a beginning in that direction. With that, I will for now hand over the conversation back to the panelists and request them to keep it short. As short as you could, because we should try to end at 6.
Well, I mean, in a forum like this, it's never done in terms of answering completely, but some thoughts. Fritz' point is very important. Certainly, most climate changes are at the global level, and we have no institutions to measure them. In fact, that's why most thinkings are always top-down at the global level. And then some benefits, some way of the receiving at the flag and it appears. I think that's a very important point. In fact, from the experience from India, we have an instrument within the constitution to empower people to earn a minimum wage under an act called National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which means every individual who is eligible, landless laborer or even a marginal farmer, is eligible to work, entitled to work at least for 100 days. Now, using this instrument, the grassroots level information being generated, grassroots level work is happening, but the data is not being generated as to what this institution is doing in terms of carbon, reversal of the carbon cross cycle. I think that's a very important point. In fact, we have been telling the environment, in fact, we carried out certain studies just to show you that out of this particular instrument that I mentioned just now, how much of improvement in the water table, groundwater table has taken place from 200 to 300 feet down to coming up to 30, 40 feet. There's a tremendous climate change impact. Similarly, not that I am mentioning about carbon sequestration, farmers planting trees as part of the agricultural practice, biodiversity-related plantations, medicinal plantations, all of them have both underground and on-surface carbon sequestration. That itself has been so significant, unmeasured, whereas we always measure in terms of what is called reserve forests, because that is one compartment. It is easy to measure number of trees multiplied by the girth, by etc. And they have a formula of estimating girth. I think that is too crude. Rather, there are are institutions, work happening, but measurements are missing. I must mention this.
I'll be brief, and I will respond to the intervention made by Jeff Campbell. I heard him saying, well, what we need is a bigger change, a change of the global economic system. And my reflex is to think and say, well, sure, but there are good reasons why we're retreating to the local level, because it's so big and impossible. And I thought a bit more and realized that much as we think cynically, and for good reasons, about the commodification of forest carbon and all that goes along with that, there's a flip side of that, which is that one reason why forest carbon is being commodified is because people around the world are all of a sudden concerned about climate change. And the arrows of concern about forests have been drastically changed in a conceptual sea change that we barely noticed. Part of what was driving our concern about deforestation for 10, 15 years was mainly concern about biodiversity and cultural survival. But now people, in their own self-interest, are worried about how the destruction of the forest commons is going to bring into question the continuation of civilization. So it's in those ways that a global economic change, we're seeing the seeds of that change now in a cultural worldwide change. And I think that our challenge is to anticipate this grand scale change that is underway already and to harness it rather than hope against hope that it will happen. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly I'll address a couple of points. Craig's point, thanks for being persuaded. Of course it's a mystery at some level. Policy is made, I think, at multiple levels. And we shouldn't think only of the government. There's non-governmental organizations. NGOs, for instance, and civil society play an enormous role both in projecting the idea and lobbying and pushing, and the media plays a huge role. So I think all of those forums are very, very important in the kinds of policies that emerge. I mean, our minister yesterday, he says he's in the news every day, but there is a media out there which is constantly questioning, evaluating, pushing, etc. So I think ideas therefore have power because policy is made in multiple forums, including civil society. In terms of governments, on the very specific question of how do we promote collectivities, one is just taking the idea that we think too much of an individual. We create rights individually. There is a very individual-oriented approach. Even when you're demanding, rights for communities, you're saying one piece of land, it must be legalized. Why don't we think of creating for a group when land is transferred, for instance, create a land trust where communities, vulnerable communities, have collective rights over that, and can't be alienated because nobody can push them and insist that they sell it off, etc., etc. That also protects you, because if you have a collective right, then it means that some large corporate that comes along can't pressure one little farmer here and there to sell off. They have to deal with the entire group. And so it gives you enormous bargaining power. So that's, governments can do that by saying, okay, we're going to transfer to groups. In the case of the Deccan Development Society, actually, the Andhra Pradesh government did something very, very simple. They said, we are going to give subsidized credit, a grant and credit scheme, 20 years, half grant, half subsidized credit, if Dalit women form a group and want to purchase land. So you have to be Dalit, landless, and you form a group. And the NGO, local NGO, of course, did provide support and motivated it. So I'm saying there are multiple ways by which we can think about it. I mean, what we see is bargaining happening. At the local level, at the medium level, over resources, over policy structures, everything. And the choices that we have is whose side are we on in terms of the bargaining that we're going to see around us. And sometimes institutions, the collectivities I talked about, or the federations, like Nepal has an all-country federation. It's the only country in the world where you have 14,000 forest user groups in a federation. And it's democratic, and they played a huge role in the democratic movement, and they bargain with the government on people's rights, and they go to climate change forums. we can build institutions of that sort. There are many examples, but I think ultimately the choices are. I would be so pessimistic, Walter. Social movements, we're just too aware. I don't think governments can now come and say we're going to just plant eucalyptus. I think it seems to me the debate has moved much beyond that.
I'll answer one or two questions which partly were addressed to me. And my good friend from Australia, now that you have apologized, I owe a reply to your question. This urban-rural common linkage, I think it's a very big issue. And in a city like Bangalore, where we have many, very small lakes in the Bangalore city, which feed other lakes which go into the rural environment. And we also have some lakes in certain western part of the city, which basically are nourished from rural intervals. So basically what happens is there's a lot of pollution of the urban lakes, there's a lot of cleaning effort, there's a huge industry thriving on that. There's a lake development authority, new bureaucracy has been created. But the rural nourishment part is never looked into. The rural-urban nexus is not looked into. I thought that is a policy failure which we need to address. The other thing is, as Dr. Walter Fernandez mentioned, I think you have a very valid point. And regarding Assam, Northeast, I have worked in Assam, in places called Dibrugad and Jorha, among the tea farmers. And I can tell you, when you raised this point, it set me thinking. In every tea garden in Assam, when the Brahmaputra changed its course because of a huge earthquake sometime in the 1950s, there's a big land use change on the tea gardens, in the sense that some areas which were planted heavily had to be removed. The tea had to be removed and left barren. And in those barren areas, people were facing famine, laborers were facing famine. At some point, the panchayats in Assam and West Bengal, they said that this land belongs to us, we have not utilized it. And the panchayat said that we will now give it to the forest department to plant trees, which would have been a disaster. It would have been a very bad thing. So that set me thinking, that's precisely what I was mentioning. Laborers came together and resisted it, they used the trade union, they were lobbied, and finally got the panchayat out of the picture. So it is not as if, panchayats come to the picture that the local self-government will solve all the problems. They hand over everything in a platter to the forest department. So I think that something of that kind needs to be done. Darjeeling also had a tradition of having valleys with large cardamom. The large cardamom used to be picked by laborers. It was a source of income stability for them, other than the wages they got. So I think this is the kind of collectivity that you need. It could be on class lines, it could be on labor on class lines, and absolutely a new solution may emerge from some of these local traditions. So this is, as far as Fikret is concerned, yes, you have a point, because people who suffer adaptation. I will give an instance of the coastal areas of Kerala, North Kerala. John Green is here, he will attest me. PWD, the Public Works Department, is very fond of putting seawalls. And the fishermen are not at all fond of getting it there. So who decides adaptation strategy? It is the PWD which will have a role in that. The fishermen do not have a role in that at all. So they would like mangroves, they would like the new hotels not to come up, because every time a hotel comes up, mangroves are chopped off, and natural biodiversity is so I can't but agree with you on this point. Thank you.
I'm still mulling over the evil role of the panchayat in the forests. I think you still can't simply leave common management of all sorts to self-organizing social movements and groups. I think representation is extremely important in this formula, and that in a lot of places you see pluralism, many institutions without representation, without representative authorities, and they tend to be formula for elite capture. And so I think, depending on where you are in histories of social organization, you have to try and think through whether or not you want to be getting the elected, democratically elected, often authorities out of the picture. It's I think, a questionable move I wanted to just respond, though, to Fikret and Jeff's questions. I'm not sure that I understood it as you did, but the question of multiple scales of institutions that affect people's well-being. And I'm not worried, by the way, about the cause of the carbon question, because that's in New Jersey and Chicago and Rome and all kinds of places around the world. And I'm not going to advocate that we pay New Jersey drivers to drive less. I mean, I actually think it's equally absurd as paying forest people to cut less. In fact, maybe it would be more effective to pay the New Jersey drivers. But on the question of institutions and vulnerability, I think there's a multi-scale question that we have not really resolved. Causality of vulnerability happens at multiple scales. It may have happened 20 years ago when a particular line was drawn or a boundary, a border. It may happen when something's turned into a reserve and people turn from hunters into poachers. It may happen when categories of belonging are shifted and some people are allowed into markets and others are not. It may happen when permits and quotas and licenses and forestry rotations are implemented that give privileges to some people and do not. But we have to look at the moments when people are on the verge of or have been in a crisis and explain that by tracing out chains of causality through time and space. And we need to trace them to various scales of social, economic, political, institutional organization at which the policies and practices that produce the marginalities associated with vulnerability are created. And I think those are the multiple scales we need to be identifying. And I think that for me, the idea of climate change itself, as Shrini has just said, it's minor in many ways compared to even the policies to correct one statistic that I saw, and I think it was an NSF study about 8 years ago. 1 in 600 easily preventable deaths are caused by climate-related incidents. If I'm a policymaker in Africa, the last thing I'm going to be dealing with is climate change. And so I think we've got to put this in perspective in some way and think about what we care about, which is human well-being. And those people who are going to be affected by climate change in some way or another, where that stress will push them over a threshold, we have to ask why they're on that threshold and understand the institutional arrangements that put them there.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid my sincere hope for a second round of questions is not going to be. One is about the larger commons that brings us here every couple of years, the International Association for the Study of the Commons. We are going to have a membership meeting at 6:30 in the auditorium in the main conference venue. And I urge as many of you to attend the membership meeting as possible because it is the right thing to do, but also because there is a very nice surprise at the end of that meeting, or even I think towards the middle of that meeting, which is the venue of the next meeting, which I am not telling you right now. The second is the organizing committee has mementos and gifts for the panelists that I'm just going to give out while all of us give them a round of applause. Thank you. Oh, that's good. Thank you very much. I get one too. Oh, there's another announcement. The organizing committee will be glad to assist you if you have any issues related to registrations, medical emergencies, instances of sexual harassment, or misbehavior. And there are a couple of names and numbers here. Would you like me to? Put them up later. Yeah, so there will be announcements and posters with this information around venues of the conference. So I will call this policy forum to a close. Thank you very much for being patient. We started late and we ended up.
This is my fourth statement, but the role of these development institutions have never taken any interest or they have least idea of dealing with local commons. I'm referring to an Indian language institution called panchayats. Under the Indian Constitution, we have an act under which local institutions do exist, and they do operate, they do function. There is a devolution of power, there is a devolution of financial resources, down all the way to the village. But these development institutions, under the Constitution of India, even though they have 29 functions or the activities to be performed, of which some of them have got to do with land, forest land, water, things like that, but they do not do. So the developmental institutions created at the grassroots level or the local level are not ecologically sound. In other words, similarly I can give examples of water user association, created only for those who have access to water or who need water. But this is not an institution meant for the community as a whole. Another example I can give you is access to forest through a system called Joint Forest Management, or another institution called Village Protection Committee, or the institution, which is not very legal but structured. But they also have behind them the political or some kind of social powers, because of which these are not really functioning as local institutions of governance. We need, therefore, very specialized system. This is my main statement. So that itself is a challenge. So I am just thinking now, what is it we should be talking differently. Anyway, I think I must make the first statement that much of the commons that we are referring, whether it's a tank or village pond or small water bodies, flowing water bodies, or common lands, as our Indian word is called panchayat land, or forest compartments closer to the village, or on which the village has some access, villagers have some access. All these are to be called only local commons. I'm sure this debate is not going to be on any other commons, climate, for example. That brings, or rather that shocks me in a way to think differently, because we all think globally on these matters. The global community around this table and in this conference, but we must and we have to act only at the local level. So it's a local action, but global thinking. My second statement, if I may be permitted to say, is the ecosystem services provided by the local commons are not at all being compensated. At best, in some situations, people with political power or other extra monetary powers, they may be able to grab the benefits or the gains of the local commons, be it water, be it access to the forest resources. But I think ecosystem services for the society, or the people, or the locals, are not really fully compensated, for which they have been protecting them. However, referring to developing countries particularly, there has been enormous thinking on developing local level developmental institutions, not ecosystem institutions or institutions to manage the ecosystems, but developmental institutions, because the process of development was, or rather is, focused on bringing livelihood, or rather, as our Honorable Indian Minister mentioned, growth. 9% growth is required for people to rise above. So this developmental focus has taken many countries to decentralized local level governance, local level institutions to deliver developmental objectives, be that the electricity supply, be that the water, drinking water, be it road, or some minimum social services like health care, educational facilities, or nutritional care, or care for women and so on. But the role of these
In the policy forum, I'm asking them to distill at least a few, maybe 2 or 3 new ideas, broad, general ideas that relate to policy, commons, and climate change. Share these with all of us. And after the panelists have made their opening statements, I would open the floor for a round of questions or comments. Again, this being a policy forum, I would urge questions or comments to be as broad in scope as the scope of the policy forum itself, as well as the opening statements and presentations from the panelists. We will take a round of questions. We will hand it back to the panelists, ask them to respond either individually or collectively to the comments that we have received. And also please feel free to make comments and not just ask questions, directed questions, to contribute to that conversation. And then the panelists will respond individually or collectively to the comments that have come from the audience. And we will hopefully have a back and forth in terms of conversations and the issues that come up. What I'm hoping is that by 6 p.m. we will be able to have at least 2 of these rounds. So opening statements, a round of questions, responses, another round of questions and responses. My sincere hope is that the conversations will not end at 6 p.m., but I will have to put an end because it has been a long day and some of us perhaps did not even get tea. In the light of time running away, I will stop here and I will ask the panelists to begin making opening statements. We have decided on a sequence that is largely random, starting with Gopal Kadekori, followed by William Sunderland, Veena Agarwal, A. Damodaran, and Jesse Ribot. And what I would also request the panelists when they come up and when they make their opening statements is spend a few seconds, if not up to a minute, to introduce themselves. Thank you very much.
My name is Gopal Kadekori. I come from India. I live in a state called Karnataka. I was formerly director of an institution called Institute for Social and Economic Change. I discovered from Ashwini's communication that there are only 7 or 8 sentences that you can speak clearly because of my Indian accent to a large number of international audience. And I think that's the time I have. In his opening remarks, introduction, he said this panel is going to think differently or present something which they have been thinking differently.